So welcome everyone to TCS Plus. Today's speaker is Shahar Lovett from UC San Diego, and the operator for today's talk is Oded Regev. And behind the scenes we have Clement Canon, G. Kamat, Thomas Hollenstein, and Thomas Vudick. So Oded will now go around the table and introduce the groups.
Okay, thank you, Anindya. We have a nearly full house today, so let's make sure. Let's see if I can do it without missing anyone. So first we have the group from Colombia, and here's Clement there. Hi, Colombia. Hi, guys. Chris Moore with the group from Santa Fe. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining. We have Kay Gopalakrishnan from Miss Carolina. And we have the group from Paris. Hello, Lila. Hello, everyone there. And we have the group from U Chicago, TTI. Hello, everyone. And here we have Michael Kapralov joining us from IBM Watson. Oh, sure. Yeah, Michael. Hi, Michael. And we have the group here, a few floors above me, Shravat Rao from NYU. Hi, guys. And the group from UC Berkeley and the Simons Institute.
Hello.
Okay, everyone there. Okay, back to you, Anindya.
Okay, thanks, Oded. So I guess you know the drill by now, but as usual during the talk, this speaker, everybody else but the speaker will be muted. If you have questions, you should unmute yourself. We encourage you to ask lots of questions. The next talk is 2 weeks from now, which is by Shayan Oveisgaran. He will talk about his breakthrough result on integrality gaps for TSPs. And so today's speaker is Shahar Lovett. Shahar is from UC San Diego. Is at UC San Diego. He finished his PhD at Weizmann. He works on complexity, additive combinatorics, Fourier analysis, that kind of stuff. In other words, he works on all problems which I really like working on, except with the exception that he can actually produce great results. So with that, sure, you can start.
Okay, thank you. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to speak here, and thanks for everybody for coming, like just before the Fox deadline. So yeah, so what I want to tell you about is, it has two aspects. One is about a more higher level aspect, which is how do we view notions of structure and sort of randomness in coding theory. And then there's a technical result which says, how we can use these things to get better results for this decoding. And this is based on joint works with Abhishek Bhowmik, who's at Austin. And let's see, so wait. Okay, so like I said, so what we'll do technically is to study Reed-Muller codes and try to understand them better. But really what you should think of happening behind the scenes is really these notions of structure and of pseudo-randomness. And we'll see how they play important roles today in coding theory, but you should be aware that they actually play an important role in many computational problems, mathematical problems, and so on. So this will really be a manifestation of this idea applied to coding theory. So what I won't be assuming any previous knowledge. I'll start with some brief introduction to coding theory and the type of questions that we'll be interested at understanding. And then I'll tell you about three themes that go into analyzing the codes. One will be notions of regularity, which have been applied a lot in combinatorics, for example, in graph theory. And I think that's the first time that they've actually been applied to coding theory. So we'll see how this will be applied here. Then we're going to see two very different aspects of polynomials, structural properties and pseudo-random properties, and we'll see how at the end they all tie together to get us a result. And again, if you have any questions, then please stop me and ask. So let's just start with some brief introduction to coding theory. So really, the most basic problem of coding theory is how do you recover from errors. So you have, some channel, you send some data over this channel, so you have some message in your mind that you want to send to the other side, but they receive the noisy version of it. So we'll think of you sending a correct code word, but the other side receives a noisy word, a noisy received word, and their goal is to recover the original code word that we intended to send from the noisy version that they received. And in this work, I'll be assuming a worst case model, so there's some bound on the number of coordinates, which was there's an error. Okay, so we won't be assuming any noise or any probabilistic noise model will be assuming just some upper bound on the amount of noise. So really the most basic concept is that of unique decoding. So if you think here of the blue dots as just representing your code words, so maybe I was intending to send so can you see the cursor?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So if I was intended to see, let's say, to send this received word, this code word, but you actually receive this X, then when you say, well, what's the most likely code word you came for, which should be the closest code word. So you say, well, this probably means this was the original code word. So this is a basic unique decoding, and it's been used in many applications, but it has an inherent limitation. And the inherent limitation in our noise model is that sometimes you can get confused between a few code words. So, like I was saying, unique decoding means find the closest code word, and sort of, if you happen to just be in between two code words, then you cannot distinguish which one it is, which puts an inherent limitation on the error, which is half the minimal distance of the code. So maybe just to explain by pictures, let's say, for example, these two code words happen to be the closest one in my code, and I'm very unlucky, so the received word happens to just be in between them, then I don't have a way of really knowing did they come from this code word or that code word. And if this is a minimal distance, then I'm lying in the between them, so it's half the minimal distance of the code. So in general, in a worst case model, if we're assuming that the distance or the amount of errors that are being incurred is more than half the minimal distance of the code, then there is no way of doing unique decoding. And sort of the classical solution for it is to say, well, let's not just return one code word, but return a short list of potential code words. This is called list decoding. And this basically breaks this half minimal distance, and you can prove a bound that says, well, in such a case, you can still return a short list of code words up to a larger distance. This distance is called a Johnson bound, and it typically lies between half the minimal distance and the minimal distance of the code. So you might hope to use this to improve by a factor of 2 the amount of errors that you can recover, but somehow it lies in between them. And sort of, I won't tell you what this Johnson bound is exactly because we're never going to use it. What I want to mention is, we know that the Johnson bound is tight if you construct, like adversarially a code. You can construct codes for which the Johnson bound is tight, but it's not known to be tight for, like natural families of codes, like the one we'll be studying today. And sort of, what I want to make a point of is that, for some special codes, like code that we actually see in practice, the Johnson bound is not necessarily a tight bound, and we might hope to do better than the Johnson bound. So basically, just the notion of list decoding, if you've never seen it in the past, is that now we have a larger allowed radius, or a larger, we might say there might be more errors and half the minimal distance. So if that's the radius corresponds to the amount of errors that we believe occurred, then now we'll return the list of these 4 code words instead of just one code word. And then we do some post-processing stage to discover which one it is, which I will not get into here. So the goal will just be to return a short list of code words. So now let me move to the family of codes that we'll be studying, which are polynomial codes. So in general, in coding theory, nearly all families of codes are based on polynomials in various forms. And in this talk, I'll just talk about the most basic families, which are called Reed-Solomon or Reed-Muller codes. So in fact, Reed-Solomon are just evaluations of low-degree univariate polynomials, and Reed-Muller are extensions to evaluations of low-degree multivariate polynomials, and I'll mainly be focusing on the multivariate case, or Reed-Muller codes. So these are very, very basic codes. It's very easy to define them, but sort of I think because they are so basic, we have many applications of them, both in real-life applications as well as in theory, and sort of we understand many aspects of them, but many aspects we do not understand, even though they are so basic. So the goal of this work is to try and understand one aspect of them somewhat better. So you can ask why polynomial codes, and one answer that I'm going to sort of want to emphasize in this talk is that they are special. They do not behave like worst-case codes. They behave better, and this was known for some range of parameters, and I'll get into it in a bit, but in this work we sort of extend the range of parameters where we know they are better than worst-case codes. So now let's be a bit more technical. So let me just define formally Reed-Muller codes, because that's going to be the family of codes that we're going to study throughout the talk. So Reed-Muller codes are basically, you take multivariate polynomials over finite fields and you evaluate them over all possible inputs. So we'll denote them by 3 parameters, Reed Muller, over a field. So the field is going to be a finite field. And in this talk, we're mainly going to assume this is a prime finite field. N is going to be the number of variables, and D is going to be the degree. Okay, so we have 3 parameters. Which field we're working on, how many variables we have for the polynomial, and what's the degree of the polynomial, some degree bound of the polynomial. And the code words are just, you take all low degree polynomials and you evaluate them over all possible inputs. Or equivalently, code words are going to be all the functions from f to the n to f. Such functions can be represented by a low degree polynomial. So the degree as a polynomial is at most d. So just to be sure, so everybody is happy with the definition of Reed-Muller codes if you haven't seen them in the past. Yeah, good. So what do we know about them? So we know various basic facts about them. For example, we know what the minimal distance is. So in general, what is a minimal distance? So we're thinking of code words, or in general, our functions are going to be functions from f to the n to f, and their distance is just the relative distance is a fraction of points where they differ. It's a fraction of points x, where f of x and g of x gets a different value, and the minimal distance of a code in general is just a minimal distance between any 2 distinct code words in it, any 2 functions in our case. And for Reed-Muller codes, this is just, because it's a linear code, you can just ask about the distance from 0, and this is just a minimal probability that a degree d polynomial which is non-zero is equal to 0. So it's not equal to 0. So we're asking, what is a polynomial of degree d for which we can get as many zeros as possible? Or we want to minimize a fraction of points where it's non-zero, and the answer is sort of well known. And the answer is, it doesn't really matter what the answer is, except that it's a simple formula that just depends on the degree, and there are simple polynomials that achieve it. Basically, you want to take a variable and start multiplying with shifts of it until you get as long as you can do it, basically. So it doesn't really matter at that point what this is. For example, you can think a special case if the degree is smaller than the field size, then the minimal distance is just 1 minus d over f. If the degree is larger than the field size, then you need to do some slightly more complicated calculation, but you see the formula. It doesn't really matter exactly what it is, but we know what it is. Okay, so we know what the minimal distance is, we know what half the minimal distance is, so what can we say about these things? So the first case that people have studied is what's called Hadamard codes, which just corresponds to linear functions. So you take a linear function from f to the n to f, and you evaluate it over all points. Now the minimal distance of it is 1 over f, because if you take any linear function, which is not 0, and you ask what's the probability, so this should be 1 minus 1 over f. There's a typo here. 1 minus the minimal distance is 1 over f. So the probability that a linear function is going to be equal to 0 is 1 over f, so the probability it's not 0 is always 1 minus 1 over f. And in fact, it's least decodable up to this radius. So you can take any function, and you can find efficiently all the linear functions that agree with it up to slightly below 1 minus 1 over f. And this was basically done by Goldreich and Levin, and over f2 and extended to general field by Goldreich, Rubenfeld, and Sudan. And least decoding for Hadamard codes is now a very common tool in a lot of complexity applications, learning applications, and cryptography applications, and so on. And basically, the proof is just using Fourier analysis. It uses the fact that agreement with linear functions just corresponds to having a noticeable Fourier coefficient, and a bounded function cannot have too many large Fourier coefficients. So this is like the basic idea behind how you least decode Hadamard codes, and you can actually do this algorithmically and efficiently. Now you can ask what happens if you go beyond degree 1. So then we don't really correspond to Fourier analysis anymore, but can we still say something meaningful? And here there are 2 regimes that are of interest, and sort of behave somewhat differently, and our understanding is different. Very large fields and very small fields. So let me say that the fields are very large. I'm talking about the fields being much, much larger than the degree, and the fields being small. So think, for example, as f2 or f3, a constant size field, but the degree could be something large. Okay, so these are 2 extreme regimes. So what do we know about large fields? Well, if the fields are large, well, the minimal distance, so here, now this is correct. The minimal distance is 1 minus d over the field size. And notice that here, half the minimal distance is roughly a half. So if the degree is very small compared to the field size, talking about minimal distance really loses a lot, because we really hope to be able to list the code up to roughly radius of 1. Having a very small agreement, but half the minimal distance only gives us a half. Now the Johnson bound actually gives us something which is much more useful. It says, well, combinatorially, we should be able to list the code up to radius which is maybe not 1 over d over f, but 1 minus root of d over f. So something that still approaches 1 if the degree is much smaller than the field size. And so the Johnson bound is a combinatorial bound, and sort of starting with works of Sudan, Guruswamy Sudan, and so on, we actually have algorithmic ways of achieving that. So there are algorithms that can even find all the polynomials of degree d that agree with your function up to that amount of distance. And you can even do slightly better than that using some multiplicity codes and so on, but let me not go into that here. And sort of there's a fundamental open problem here which says, what is the right answer in large fields? Is it the minimal distance or is it the Johnson bound? So we know we can do slightly better than the Johnson bound, but it's still not clear what is the correct answer here, and sort of, all the techniques break down at the Johnson bound. So this is like a fundamental open problem here. And sort of what we'll do in this work is we will not study this result. We go to the other regime, which is small fields. Now, in small fields, it turns out that we understand things better. In fact, there was a very nice breakthrough in what 6 years ago or 7 years ago by Parikshit Gopalan, Adam Clements, and David Zuckerman, and they showed that over the binary field F2, you can in fact do much better than the Johnson bound. You can list the code, the Reed-Muller codes, up to the minimal distance. And this is true both combinatorially, meaning there are not too many low-degree polynomials in any ball of a certain radius, but also algorithmically. You can find these polynomials efficiently. But somehow, unfortunately, the proof doesn't extend to the larger fields, and the reason is sort of, really annoying. They use the fact that 2 is also, is special. So the field size is F2, half the minimal distance has 2, specific properties of the Johnson bound over F2, and so on. So really the proof doesn't extend beyond F2. It extends in some regimes that I will discuss in a bit, but for general fields, general degrees, it doesn't extend beyond F2. So they formed the following conjecture that, while their technique breaks down, in fact, Reed-Muller codes should be least decodable up to the minimal distance. And in fact, they are special, so they do not behave like worst-case codes. You can least decode them beyond the Johnson bound. And what was known about it? So again, like I told you, for d equal to 1, so this was the Goldach-Levin and Goldach-Rubenfeld-Sudan result. This is the Hadamard codes. Now Parikshit Gopalan, in fact, showed this conjecture to be true for d equal to 2, using Fourier analytic techniques. And also the original work of Gopalan, Clements, and Zuckerman had some extensions to larger fields. So if the field is Fp, and p minus 1 happens to divide the degree, then the same magic happens as in the F2 case, and you can get least decoding up to the minimal distance. But somehow there is some, I would say, magic that happens of how the Johnson bound actually looks. And really what we'll do here is a totally different approach to the least decoding question. And in particular, what we'll show is that this conjecture is true. So in fact, at least over prime fields. So if you choose any constant size prime field, any constant degree, then you can do least decoding for Reed-Muller codes up to the minimal distance. In fact, we do even more. We can even give a tight bound on the number of code words up to any distance, not just a minimal distance, but I will not discuss this in this talk. But we actually give tight bounds, and the tight bounds correspond to what happens if you just try to least decode 0 or any code word. So the size of the balls around the code words roughly corresponds to the size of the balls around any potential center. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about some future work that we're working on now, where we can extend some of the things to large fields and in fact show that we can get some new result also for least decoding over large fields. So let me tell you what the main result is, and sort of through it I will maybe introduce in a more technical way this notion of least decoding. So here is the theorem. So choose any constant degree d, any constant prime field f, and look on the Reed-Muller f and d code. So really the only large parameter here is the number of variables. So these are multivariate polynomials of constant degree over constant size fields. Then such a code is least decodable up to its minimal distance. So what does it mean? It means the following thing. choose any function g from f to the n to f. So this will be your noisy received word. And we want to find all the polynomials that agree with it up to the minimal distance minus epsilon. So you choose some threshold parameter, some tolerance parameter epsilon, and you're asking what is the size of the set of low degree polynomials that agree with my function, or that they disagree with my function up to the minimal distance, but minus a little bit of slackness, epsilon. And the result is that this is some constant that could depend on the field size, the degree, and epsilon in some horrible way, but it does not depend on the number of parameters, the number of variables. So to some extent, there is some compactness phenomena happening here with low degree polynomials that sort of the number of variables doesn't play an important part. And this we'll see later on is a recurrent phenomena when we study low degree polynomials, in particular in this area of higher order Fourier analysis. And so we might get horrible bounds, but these horrible bounds don't depend on the number of variables. And so just to make sure, so is what we're trying to prove clear? So this is just a combinatorial bound, and sort of the work of Gopalan, Clears, and Zuckerman showed a generic way of taking any such combinatorial bound and transform it into an algorithm. So in fact, the algorithm works always, except that its analysis or its running time is polynomial in the combinatorial list size. So by proving good bounds on the combinatorial list size of list decoding, you automatically get a good algorithm out of it. So let me just mention some follow-up work that we have, where we're sort of trying to flush out the dependence on the parameters. So previously, we assumed that the field has to be constant. Now the new result that we are sort of near completion is that we can even prove the same results for large fields. So the field is now, so we can really make the dependence on the field size be more tight. So here will be the new results that I will not discuss in this talk, that says the same type of question. You want to do list decoding. Now over large fields, if the degree is small and the field is large, the minimal distance is again 1 minus d over f. Sorry, I have the same type again. But now the whole point is that the dependence on the field size is polynomial. So it's not a horrible dependence on the field size. It's polynomial dependence on the field size. The only horrible dependence is on the degree, essentially, because L you could just think for all applications is 10 or 100. And the error, even the threshold could be polynomially small in the field size. So this is just very briefly, this is sort of the best you could hope for doing list decoding for Reed-Muller codes without actually making progress on the Reed-Solomon code. So if you're in the constant degree case or the small degree case, then the Reed-Solomon list decoding is sort of trivial. And what we're saying here is that you can do the same thing for Reed-Muller without paying too much of an extra price. But let me not discuss this in any further details unless there are questions on it. So let me go back to what we'll prove today, which is just a fixed field size. And you can even think of the field as being F2, even though this was not for F2 because our techniques will sort of not really care about what the field is exactly. So you choose a constant degree, you choose a constant prime field, and Reed-Muller is list decodable up to its minimal distance. And really, what I want to talk to you mainly is about what ideas come into the proof. And these ideas sort of combine 3 different aspects. So one is going to be something that's very generic for codes, not specifically for Reed-Muller codes, which is this new notion of regularity applied in coding theory that I'm going to discuss next. This is going to be something generic for codes. And then we're going to see it applied to Reed-Muller codes, and we're going to study 2 specific properties of Reed-Muller codes, which are properties of low-degree polynomials. One is going to be a structural property, one is going to be a pseudo-randomness property, and then we're going to combine everything together. So let's go to the next topic, which is how do we apply notions of regularity that are sort of been developed in graph and hypergraph concepts, and also in some other areas of math, like for example, harmonic analysis, and apply them to coding theory. So what is the basic problem here that we have in this decoding? So really, let me just step back for a second and just think of a code that's just been some family of functions. So a code is just some family of functions f from some domain x to some codomain y. Right? So we had x being f to the n and y being f, but let's ignore that for now. So just some domain and some codomain. And the received word is just some other function, g from x to y. And what are we trying to understand in the list decoding problem? We're trying to understand the following object. We're looking on the ball around g of radius rho, but we only care about code words in this ball. So we're looking at all functions in my code that have some distance from my received word up to some bound row. Right? So this is basically, it's a ball, but it's a ball intersected with the code. And really the goal is to prove an upper bound on how many functions you have in this ball for any center G. Where, for example, what we do here is we set row to be the minimal distance of the code minus some small slackness parameter, but you can ask this for any arbitrary radius row. And here's a problem when you're trying to analyze these problems. When we study codes, code words are very structured or very nice. If they're low-degree polynomials, we can apply algebraic techniques to them, and we can study them. But the received word is arbitrary. We have no control over it, so we can't really assume that it has any nice structure. So what I want to show you now is a technique that can take such a received word and make it look nice. And by making it look nice, we'll actually be able to apply a lot of algebraic techniques to study it. So here is a lemma. And this lemma will be for any code. So for any code, you can take any received word, and you can replace it with what I'm going to call a low complexity received word. I'm going to define this formally in the next slide. But here, let's keep it at an intuitive level. So you can replace any received word with a low complexity received word, such that this new received word, which is nice, is in some sense indistinguishable from the original received word if you are viewing it from the code perspective. So for the least decoding type of problems, you can replace your original received word, which could be very complicated, with a much simpler received word, which is nice. And this sort of, if you know the notions of weak regularity, the Fries-Cannon type of weak regularity in coding theory, in graph theory, this is very similar. And sort of it works by viewing code words as being tests. So really, we're thinking of a code word as just testing your distance to it, and all the code words as a family of tests that we're trying to fool. So what is a formal lemma? So it's the following. So choose any code. So a code is just a collection of functions from x to y. Choose any received word, which is another function, g from x to y, and choose an error term, which is epsilon. So there exists a low complexity received word g prime from x to y, such as the following holds. First of all, if you take the ball around g of radius rho, it's contained in the ball around g prime of a slightly larger radius. So it's enough to bound the size of the ball around g prime of a slightly larger radius. But more importantly, g prime is nice. So if we view code words as having complexity 1 objects, then g prime has a bounded complexity. And more formally, we can form g prime as a composition of a small number of code words. So there is some composition function gamma, which is nice. It's basically a majority function, but we won't really care about it here. It really behaves like a majority of a small number of code words. Okay? In fact, g prime has to be randomized, but let me again ignore this subtle point here. But for the purpose of this talk, keeping it at a slightly intuitive level, just think of g prime as just being the majority function of this number of code words. And basically, what we say is that this g prime essentially behaves the same as g. In fact, what is true is that take any code word and ask what's its distance from g, and what is its distance from g prime. Those are going to agree up to an error of epsilon. So how do you prove it? So basically, let's say the lemma by picture says, no, we're given initially this received word, which is maybe this x, which might be some ugly received word, and we know that somehow there are these 4 code words in the ball around it. Well, we can replace it by some other received word, a low complexity received word. Such in a ball of a slightly larger radius, I'm going to contain exactly the same code words. Now, it won't contain the original ball, but since I only care about the ball intersected with the code word, it will contain the same set of code words. Maybe some other new ones, but it will at least contain these ones.
Shachar?
Yes.
Just to emphasize this once more, so you're saying it's not like g prime is within distance epsilon of g, right? It's just that the code words are the same within those balls, right?
Yes, that is correct. So the distance here is not a Hamming distance. It's a distance as viewed from the code. So it's sort of, for every code word, the distance from G and the distance from G prime are going to be the same up to a small error.
Thanks.
Also, this procedure, it's not algorithmic, right?
Well, you can make it algorithmic if you are able to find, well, two things. First of all, for us, we won't really care if it's algorithmic because we just handle the combinatorial bound, and for Reed-Muller codes, it's going to be enough. But more generally, it can be algorithmic. If you're able to solve a certain least decoding problem, you can make it algorithmic. So sort of, to make it algorithmic, you have to be sort of like a cyclical in a bit. But if you can solve some version of a least decoding problem, you can make it algorithmic. The same way that, the Fries-Cannon weak regularity type of results can be made algorithmic. So what is the proof? So just one slide about the proof. So if you know the proof of the Fries-Cannon weak regularity lemma, then the proof here is very similar. And if you don't know the proof, then you should know it. It's a very interesting proof to know. And the basic idea is the following: you just try and basically build this G prime from the ground up. So you start by saying what we'll maintain is a function G prime, which is going to be a randomized function, but let's ignore that here, from X to Y, such that for all code words, the distance of F from G prime is going to be the same as the distance from F to G, up to some small error term. And initially, we just think of G prime as just being the constant function. And if it's randomized, it's going to be just a global distribution of G. And every time we say, is this G prime good? Let's say that it's not good. So we can find a code word whose distance from G and G prime is different. So we can actually use this function to refine G prime. And you can sort of show, so maybe I'll just use this, move this so you can see. So by doing this process, what you can show that you learn more information about G. So you start by just knowing the distribution of G. You found a code word which tells you, oh, you actually know something more about it because the distance of F to G and to G prime is different. So you learn something more about G, and sort of there's a bound of how much you can learn. So you can show that this process of terminates quickly, and the way you do it formally is by some energy increment argument. So again, the details here are such that it's a one-page proof. It's not very hard, and it's very similar to the Fries-Cannon weak regularity lemma. But if you're interested in the details, then I suggest that you look at the paper. So the paper is available online. Okay, so this is basically all I want to say about the proof of this regularity lemma. So what's the upshot? The upshot is that basically, for solving any type of least decoding problem, we can always assume the following nice scenario, that our received word is basically just a composition of a small number of code words. And like I told you, this composition is by a nice function. Now, this might be interesting for some applications. For our specific application for Reed-Muller codes, this will not be of any importance. So from now on, I'll just treat gamma as an arbitrary composition function, but you should remember that it's basically some variation of majority. And like I told you, G has to be randomized, but let me again ignore this here. Okay, so this is what we're going to assume. From now on, our received word is of low complexity. Another question is this useful? And the reason this will be useful is we'll see ways of saying, oh, we understand the minimal distance of the code, and you can sort of translate it into understanding some versions of minimal distance for compositions of a few code words. Okay, so now we're going to move to studying Reed-Muller codes, which are low-degree polynomials, and we're going to start in a very, very special case. And then later on, we're going to apply pseudo-randomness ideas to show that this is not such a special case. But initially, this should look like a very special case. So what we have is we have a received word G, which is a composition of a constant number of code words. And let's assume something very, very special. Let's assume that each one of our low-degree polynomials does not depend on all the variables. It just depends on a few, let's say a constant number of variables. So really what we have is a received word which just depends on a very small number, a constant number of variables. And the question is this useful? So if we know that our received word, now we're going back to the Reed-Muller code question, it just depends on the first 100 variables. Is this useful? And like you can imagine, this is useful, right? We know a lot. So let's look at a very, very, very special case where it depends on no variables at all, it's just 0. Well, then we're in a very good place because we know that if we have just by the minimal distance property, if we have any code word whose distance from 0, which is a code word also, is smaller than the minimal distance, then it has to be 0. There's no other code words which agree with 0, whose distance from 0, is less than the minimal distance. And basically what we'll do is so that we can extend this basic concept to when the received word depends on just a few coordinates. So here is a structural lemma for polynomials or Reed-Muller codes. So assume we have a function g that depends on the first c bits, or the first c field elements. If the distance of a low-degree polynomial f from g is strictly smaller than the minimal distance, then it has to depend on the first c bits. So you think if c was 0, then we said f has to be 0. Then what we say here is, well, if g depends on the first 100 coordinates, then f agrees with it better than the minimal distance, then f has to depend on the first 100 coordinates. Right? Now, notice that g here is not a low-degree polynomial. G here is an arbitrary function. Okay, so this is the strength of this structural lemma. G could be any arbitrary function. Still, you have to depend on the first c bits. In particular, one corollary is that there are not that many polynomials of that form. So if we're trying to solve the least decoding problem, here we can even solve it up to anything below the minimal distance. We don't even need the slackness parameter of epsilon. The epsilon will come out once we go to study a more general problem. But here we say, well, if G is very special in that sense, we can really solve the least decoding problem very efficiently. So how do we prove it? Well, the proof again is going to be something very simple. It's going to just be some variant of the Schwarz-Zippel lemma. So the Schwarz-Zippel lemma is the way you prove or you analyze the minimal distance of Reed-Muller codes, or you analyze what is the minimal probability that a low-degree polynomial is 0. And here we're going to do something very similar. So remember, what we're trying to prove is that, a function that has better than the minimal distance of the code from G, with G depends on the first c bits, can only depend on the first c bits. So let's try and prove that it has to be true. Let's say f depends on some other bit. Let's say the nth bit, or the nth coordinate. So we just expand f is a low-degree polynomial, so we can expand it as a low-degree polynomial in xn. So we have xn to the I going from 0 to d, multiplied with some polynomial of the remaining variables, right? And we're saying, well, we also have g. Well, g doesn't depend on xn. It just depends on the first c coordinates. So let's look at the distance of f and g. Well, it's just a probability that f and g disagree. And we're going to compute this in the following way. We're going to average out x1 up to xn minus 1. And we're going to basically ask what's the probability that f and g disagree here. Okay? And the main idea, though we don't have all the details, but the main idea is basically you follow the same proof as the Schwarz-Zippel lemma, and you note that g only corresponds to the constant term here. It doesn't contribute to any of the fi except for f0, and you can then you get basically something that looks like the average of the probability that the degree of the polynomial is non-zero, which has to be at least the minimal distance of the code. So again, I'm slightly cheating here, but again, if you know the proof of the Schwarz-Zippel lemma, this follows exactly the same proof, but you notice that the g just contributes to the constant term of this polynomial f, this decomposition of f.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So in the second last line, the expectation over x1 to xn, is this the expectation of the probability over xn that f of x differs from g of x?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is a typo. It's the expectation of the probability. And basically the way you analyze it, you look on the highest degree. Let's say where you see this, and if this degree is d, for example, then this has to be a constant, and this is always non-zero. You just get the average of a degree the polynomial being non-zero, which is at least delta d of f. If this is not 0, if this is some lower degree, then this is some low degree polynomial, and you do run the same calculations, and you apply this lemma by induction. I mean, again, if you know the proof of the Schwarz-Zippel lemma, all I can tell you is this is a very similar proof, and if you don't know the proof, then you should know it, because again, it's a very basic lemma to know. And again, the proof is very similar, and you can look on the details in the paper. So basically, so here the proof was relatively simple, but this should not be very surprising, because remember what we're doing, we're just trying to analyze a very simple case where the received word just depends on a constant number of coordinates. So we can analyze this in a very clean way, which should not be very surprising. And so the real question is, why is this useful? Okay, so we analyze this very, very special case. Why is this useful for the general least decoding problem? And here stuff, these notions of pseudo-randomness of polynomials are going to become important. So what is the notion of pseudo-randomness for polynomials? So here's the definition. We say the polynomial f is pseudo-random if it cannot be approximated by any lower degree polynomial. So let me not make things very precise, but just intuitively, for example, for every low degree polynomial g, the probability that this agree is just what you'll expect to find if you do it randomly, right? So a random function would agree with f probability 1 over the field size, and you can't get anything better by choosing g to be any low degree polynomial. Okay, so this is the notion of being a pseudo-random polynomial. And basically, so just to give some examples, so linear functions, if they're not zero, they're always pseudo-random. Because, take any linear function, for example, the sum of the first n elements, the probability equal to any low degree polynomial, in this case a constant, is always 1 over the field size. Now, quadratics are high rank if they are high rank. The notion of a high rank quadratic just corresponds to a high rank matrix. And being pseudo-random just corresponds to this matrix having high rank. So for example, if my quadratic happens to be x1 squared plus x2 squared plus xn squared, and the field is not f2, so this is really a quadratic, then the probability is equal to any linear function is really 1 over the field size plus an error term that decays exponentially fast in the number of variables. So if I have many variables, if this is a high rank matrix corresponding to this quadratic, we get this corresponds to the notion of being pseudo-random quadratic. Now, the nice thing that you can extend these notions also for higher degree polynomials. So if you study the correspondence to matrices, you get tensors. We don't really understand notions of ranks for tensors, but sort of based on work that people have been doing, in the last few years in this area called higher order Fourier analysis, we now understand them better. So we don't understand them completely the same way that we understand matrices, but we understand them to some large extent at least in a qualitative way. So here is, a very strong theorem that, you should be aware of, which is a dichotomy theorem for polynomials. It said that low-degree polynomials are either very structures or very pseudo-random. They cannot be in between. So for example, if you think of graph theory, when you have regularity for graphs and a graph could have a pseudo-random part and a structural part, this does not happen for low-degree polynomials. They're one of two extremes, either very structured or very pseudo-random. And the formal theorem is the following. If you have a low-degree polynomial, and you can even slightly approximate this polynomial by a lower-degree polynomial, then you can, in fact, decompose your polynomial into a function of a small number of lower-degree polynomials. And here we assume the degree is constant, and k is a constant. If the degree is a constant, but it depends on the degree in some horrible way, in an Ackermann-like way, and sort of, we don't know if that's true or not, but that's the best we could prove. But at least in the regime of constant degree polynomials, we have this very, very strong dichotomy theorem. And you can think of it as an extension of the following fact for matrices. If a matrix has low rank, you can decompose it as a function of a few rank 1 matrices. And rank 1 matrices corresponds to linear functions. So this is an extension of that to higher degree polynomials or to higher dimensional tensors, as long as the dimension is constant. So this was sort of, so this was started in the works of Green and Tau and me and Tali Kaufman about 7 years ago, and sort of have been developed a lot since then. And we're going to use these tools. And this dichotomy theorem, basically you can, so we'll not talk much about it, but I'll tell you that you can apply these things iteratively and take any low degree polynomial and decompose it as a function of a few polynomials, which are all very pseudo-random. So the way you do it, you say, well, if my original polynomial is pseudo-random, I'm done. If not, we can decompose it as a function of a few lower degree polynomials. If they are pseudo-random, we are done. If not, you decompose them further and so on. And since the degree goes down at every stage, this has to stop at some point. So you get this decomposition as a function of a few very pseudo-random polynomials. And to a large extent, pseudo-random polynomials behave as independent random variables. They have no dependencies between them. And to make this precise, there's this area called higher order Fourier analysis. They study these objects, but I will not discuss any of these details here because they are sort of somewhat technical. So what is the upshot of all of that? It's the following thing. So we can take, like if you remember, we had a received word G, which was some composition of a few lower degree polynomials. And now we can even use these tools and say that they are very random polynomials. They are pseudo-random polynomials. So Z1 up to ZC are some polynomials in our variables, and we're assuming they are pseudo-random polynomials. So they, to a large extent, behave like random inputs. Now we can take our function f, any function that is potentially in the ball, and we can decompose the sum function of these things, and everything else it depends on. So maybe this function f doesn't depend on Z1 up to ZC at all. So we just take everything else it depends on, and we decompose the function of those as well. And then basically we take the analysis we did for the function g depending on a few bits and apply it again here. So basically if f agrees with g better than the minimal distance, then it cannot depend on w1 up to wc prime. It has to depend on z1 up to zc, and we can reuse the analysis, or just move this way. We can reuse the proof that we had for the case of the function g dependent on a few bits and extend it to the case where g depends on a few low-degree polynomials, which are very pseudo-random. So again, making this work is sort of somewhat technical, so I'm not going to give the details here, but if you're interested, you can look at the paper. So just to summarize, so what we saw here is that Reed-Muller codes are special. They can be least decoded beyond the Johnson bound, in fact, up to the minimal distance. And what I did not discuss here, but you can read the paper in the paper, is you can even get tight bounds for how many code words you have in any radii. Not just a minimal distance, but you can choose your favorite radius that you need for application, and we give tight bounds on the number of code words you have there. And the proof relies on 3 ingredients. So one is this new notion of applying regularity type lemmas for least decoding problems, and then 2 special properties for Reed-Muller codes, which are properties of polynomials. One is a structural property of what happens if these polynomials depend on a few bits. One is a pseudo-randomness properties, and then combine them together to get a result for all, basically, functions, or all centers. And like I told you, that we have some follow-up work where we can extend these results to large fields. So I'll tell you in a nutshell what are the new ingredients that are required. So first of all, you need to optimize the arguments and get a polynomial dependency on the field size, and you need to extend higher order Fourier to large fields and get it to get bounds which are uniform in the field size or independent of the field size. And the last thing that you need, which took us a while to realize, so maybe I'll just go back a lot to show you the picture. If you remember, we had this notion of regularity for least decoding, and we said, oh, we had this potential received word. It might be very ugly. We can replace it with this very nice received word, which agrees for all the tests. Well, once you go to large fields or large alphabets, you need to have multiple low complexity received words, and you know that one of them is going to be good proxy for you, but you don't know which one. So it might be that every code word requires a different low complexity received word, but you can use only a few of them and cover all the code words. So these require some this sort of, which way should I be going? Other way. This is sort of the last piece that is required to be generalized. So this paper, I'm hoping, the new version, I'm hoping to be available online in a month or so. So maybe just, what's the take-home message here? So even if you don't really care about coding theory, the take-home message is that, these notions of structure and pseudo-randomness are very powerful. And, we know that is to be true, because they have so many applications in math and CS and so on. But in particular, in these regimes where you can have dichotomy theorems, they are very, very powerful. So you can take every object, either structural or pseudo-random, or more generally, like in graphs, for example, every object can be decomposed as a structural part and a pseudo-randomness part. And sort of, one question I'm, personally very interested in is what other domains can you apply these ideas? What other codes, other domains in general in CS? This seem to be fundamental concepts, so we should have more applications for them. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shiva.
It's still muted. Can I ask a question?
Chris. Yes.
Sure.
So, Shahar, thanks for the talk. So, notion of
I can't hear you.
simple example of a non-pseudorandom polynomial,
Mm-hmm.
polynomial where the number of roots is significantly bigger than 1, right?
Well, it depends if you're thinking of a univariate or a multivariate polynomial. So
Let's say it's univariate.
Univariate, okay.
So
So
I have a 10th order polynomial.
yeah.
If it were if its coefficients would be uniformly random,
Mm-hmm.
then the expected number of roots is 1.
Yeah.
Is 10. Let's say it has 5 roots.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be approximated by the 0 function 5 times as well as we would expect.
Yeah.
Random polynomial. So it can be decomposed somehow in terms of lower degree polynomials? I'm trying to see exactly how this works.
Yeah. Okay. So all these techniques don't really make much sense in the univariate case. They make more sense in the multivariate case. So, for example, if you have a univariate polynomial, it's just a function of one variable, right? X.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's potential that there could be some extensions to the case of univariate large fields. So, no, univariate small fields really makes no sense. So, univariate case, large fields. So, okay. So, I mean, there could be potential extension, but so far we don't know how to get this to work. So, all that we know how to do is say the multivariate case behaves in many similarities to the univariate case. But we don't really know ways of applying these things in a meaningful way to univariate polynomials.
Okay. So are there explicit constructions in the multivariate case of families of pseudo-random polynomials of, arbitrarily large degree?
Yeah, so for example, if your field, let's say, is more than D, you just take x1 to the D plus x2 to the D plus x3 to the D and so on, plus xn to the D. This is, a pseudo-random polynomial. In fact, it is in a very strong sense. You can prove that its correlation with every low-degree polynomial is decay exponentially fast with n. But this is a deep result in algebraic geometry. This is by Deligne. This sort of extend Wales bounds from the univariate to the multivariate case, and this is a non-singular polynomial, so it has these properties. But so in that sense, it is very, very pseudo-random.
And where do I find a good paper where I can learn about this stuff about higher order Fourier analysis? If I Google higher order Fourier analysis, will I get good results?
Well, unfortunately, there's no good survey at the moment. So me, Puya Khatami, and Hamid Khatami have these plans of writing a survey on this at some point, which hopefully would happen. But currently, so there is a book actually by Terry Tao on higher order Fourier analysis. I think his main focus on number theory applications. So it might not be exactly what you're looking for, but there is this book. We're planning to write a survey that is more CS-oriented, focusing on finite fields more. If you look on the research papers, so many of them start by giving a background and all the necessary details on how the Fourier, and then develop them one step further. So if you want, I can send you some papers that I think could have a good explanation of the concepts.
Thanks.
Sure.
So I also have a question. Thanks for the talk first. And then I would like to know if it is possible to say something with these techniques in the case in which the rate of the code is constant. So D would be something like n over 2, and then you have to let n grow.
Okay. So then what happens if so there are two different techniques that we had here. One was this general results for this decoding, and those don't really depend on the rate of the code. Those work for any codes. And the other techniques are the ones that are specialized for constant degree polynomials, because this is where we can analyze things. And then you don't really get, concentrate. Now, part of the goal of going to large fields, one of my future plans is to try and understand whether you can apply various algebraic geometric techniques to study large fields and large degrees, so degrees which are polynomial in the field size, where algebraic geometric techniques actually apply. So these things, people know how to do things in a very restricted setting, where the notions of, structure is just that your polynomial factors as a product of a few polynomials. But there is no good understanding of what happens when you extend it to more general notions of structure. And in general, so things are, it's less well understood, I would say. Yeah, but currently these techniques don't apply to the constant rate case.
Okay, thanks.
Shahar?
Yeah.
So you were very careful to specify prime fields.
Mm-hmm.
Where in all of this did you use something that you don't know how to do for other finite fields?
Okay, so I suspect. Okay, so one thing which we use prime fields is that the higher order Fourier business has been studied for prime fields. Now, I don't think there's something special about it. I think everything could be generalized to, in this case, constant size, let's say non-prime fields, except that we haven't done it. It would require some work. I don't think that there's something that's stopping me from doing it. It just requires some extra work. So really, the only part here where things don't work as is in the higher order Fourier business. But I think if you're in the regime of constant degree and constant fields, you can always just move to higher degrees and move to the prime field. So this would be fine. The only case where things will actually require new concepts are when you go to the large field case.
Thanks.
Shahar?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if there's anything interesting you want to say about this, but can you compare the ideas you mentioned here, the structure, pseudorandomness, to the ideas you had in a previous paper with Kaufman and Porat?
Yeah, okay. So there what we studied was the question of list decoding for Reed-Muller over F2, but for larger radius. So the techniques are actually very different. What we did there is sort of, hands-on list decoding, showing that you can actually find these things and understand the structure. And what we do here is sort of, more using an alternate approach of saying, let's just first reduce the list decoding problem in general to list decoding of low complexity codewords, and then use this specifically in the analysis. So it's actually a very different approach. In particular, here we're using these notions of higher order Fourier, and there we didn't need to use them. We just studied polynomials in a much more direct way.
And in terms of bounds, is it the same bound that you get on the list decoding parameter?
Okay. So here's the benefit of the more direct techniques is that when they work, they give you much better dependencies. And in fact, there was this recent work by Avi Vigdazon, Amir Shpilka, and Emmanuel Ebb that sort of extended our results to even larger degrees and better rates and got tighter bounds, which is you can only do it because you're studying codes directly. The benefit of higher order Fourier is that you can study things in a more general setting and get better qualitative results, but you get horrible quantitative bounds. So you cannot really apply these techniques for any degrees which are beyond constant, for example. So this is a negative aspects of this type of techniques.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a question about the pseudo-randomness part of polynomials.
Sure.
So, when you said, okay, for quadratic correlation with lower degree polynomials would be looking at the rank of the associated.
Just go back there. Just go back there.
Yeah. So for higher order polynomials, can you look at the tensor and then say something with the relation to the tensor rank?
Yes, it's exactly the same. Well, it's not quite. So the tensor rank talks about you want to take your tensor and you want to decompose it as the sum of a few rank 1 tensors. Right. Now the question is, what is a rank 1 tensor? And it turns out there's two different definitions that make sense. So the standard definition of a rank 1 tensor is just a product of, but what's the tensor? Let's say you have a dimension 3 tensor. So you can think of a tensor as being a cubic polynomial in x, y, and z. So you have 3 sets of variables. And then a rank 1 tensor would just be a linear function of x times a linear function of y times a linear function of z, basically. And this is the standard notion. What we have here is a different notion of a rank 1 tensor, which is anything that depends, I would say, on x, y, and z in a quadratic way. So this is you allow more objects to be rank 1 tensors.
Okay.
So this is in some sense a stronger definition of high rank.
Any more questions before going back to the Fox deadline? No?
Let's go off there then.
Okay, so we should. So if there are no questions, Anindya, do you want to remind us the next talk?
Yeah, so next talk, thanks. So the next talk is by Shayana Weisgaren in 2 weeks from now, and as I said in the beginning, he'll be talking about integrality gaps for asymmetric CSPs.
Okay, thanks. So thanks again, Shachar, and I'll take it offline. Everyone is welcome to stay here and ask more questions that you don't want to ask publicly. So I'm going offline. 3, 2, 1.